legendary origins, and Solomon's Temple. Greetings and welcome. Today I will tell you the secret history of Freemasonry, a 600-year journey of rituals, symbols, whispered oaths, and conspiracies that refuse to die. We will trace it from its legendary beginnings to the lodges of Europe and America, through revolutions, scandals, disappearances, and that power which does not always leave fingerprints. If you enjoy these stories, please leave a like and subscribe. It is the best way to support the channel. And write to me in the comments. Do you believe Freemasonry is mostly about tradition or mostly about influence? Thank you for being here. Now, close your eyes if you wish, and let us begin. If you ask a Mason how it all began, you often won't get a date in the way a historian would give it. You will get a scene. A king in Jerusalem who wants to build a temple that will outlive him. A chosen architect named Hiram Abiff who knows the plan and the measurements. A construction site divided into ranks with passwords that separate the master from the man who simply carries stones. In this account, the first lodge is not a social club. It is the inner circle surrounding the construction of Solomon's first temple, which tradition dates to a period roughly 3,000 years ago. The story goes that 3 envious workers tried to force from Hiram the secret of the master's word. When he refuses, they kill him. The body is hidden. Later, he is resurrected through a special handshake and a word known only to the initiated. For generations, this drama has been repeated in Masonic rituals as a central lesson of loyalty, honor, and the price of betrayal. It also serves another purpose. It plants the idea that the order has roots in the ancient era of sacred architecture, that its secrets are woven into the stones of the holy city, and that the line of transmission stretches back to a time when kings, priests, and builders shared mysteries that the rest of the world could only guess at. From a researcher's perspective, this myth is a kind of map. It speaks to what the Brotherhood itself wants to believe. It claims antiquity. It claims proximity to the biblical past. It suggests that the real history of power has always been connected to a small group of people who know more than the general public. This alone was enough to fuel centuries of speculation. Some authors took the story of Hiram and developed it further, claiming that the secrets kept in Solomon's temple came from even more ancient sources: Egyptian schools of geometry, Babylonian stargazers, or a priestly class guarding sacred measurements and calendars in the ancient Near East. They point to the fact that the temple in Jerusalem was built using precise proportions, that these ratios reappear in later monuments, and then draw a direct line to Masonic symbols such as the square, the compasses, the all-seeing eye, and the unfinished pyramid. In this interpretation, the lodge is not a social invention of the early modern period. It is the last visible layer of a much older system of storing and transmitting specialized knowledge about numbers, proportions, and order. Knowledge that always had political undertones, because it could be used for designing cities, planning fortifications, and even structuring religious rituals. If we set the legend aside for a moment and look at what has been preserved in the archives, the first solid traces of something recognizably Masonic appear in medieval Europe. Not in a temple city, but in the cold workyards of cathedrals and castles. Starting from the 12th century, majestic stone buildings were being erected across the continent. Their arches, vaults, and towers required a level of skill that ordinary rural builders did not possess. Men capable of performing this work were in demand, and they moved from place to place as projects began and ended. To protect their pay and status, they formed lodges and guilds. These were not yet the lodges of modern Freemasonry with their formal degrees, but they had rules, leaders, and customs. They regulated apprenticeships. They established standards of work. They decided who was in and who was out. The word lodge itself initially referred to the physical hut or shelter on the construction site, where the masons met, ate, and stored their tools. Over time, it also came to mean the group that gathered there, a circle of initiates separated from unskilled laborers and outsiders. The most important evidence of this world has reached us in the form of the old charges, a group of manuscript texts that were copied since at least the 14th century. The oldest known copy is often called the Regius Manuscript. It is believed to date from roughly the late 1300s. Another early document is known as the Cook Manuscript. These documents are sets of rules, legends, and moral instructions presented as the ancient law of the craft. They describe how a mason should behave toward God, toward his Lord, and toward his fellow workers. They insist on obedience, secrecy, and loyalty. One of the striking features of these texts is that they include a legendary history of the craft that goes far beyond any real guild in England. They claim that geometry originated in Egypt, that it was taught by Euclid, and that it was brought to England by a noble figure during the time of King Aethelstan. This pattern becomes very familiar once you see it a few times. A profession that needs to justify its place in a strict social order invents a noble, even royal, origin story for itself. The effect is to turn a practical occupation into a tradition rooted in sacred and royal history. In the case of the Masons, it also lays the foundation for subsequent generations to claim, with a straight face, that their activities have always been connected to the hidden structure of civilization. The records of these guilds also tell us about secrecy. Long before the emergence of speculative Freemasonry, the old churches do not prescribe passwords or detailed handshakes, but they mention keeping the counsel of the craft, and that certain things should not be written down where outsiders could read them. There are hints that Masons had signs by which they recognized each other, and by which they confirmed their level of training. Some scholars have compared this to other medieval crafts that also protected specialized knowledge. But the Masons stand out for one simple reason. They dealt with plans involving churches, royal projects, and fortifications. Their blueprints and skill in calculating loads and angles gave them contacts with patrons at the very top of society. This fact alone prompted later authors to imagine lodge meetings where not only rates and schedules were discussed, but also affairs of state, especially in times when kings were at war, or when religious reforms made open discussion dangerous. The religious world in which all of this took place was tense and controlled. Europe lived under the rule of the Church, which claimed authority in matters of faith, and it knew from experience that alternative teachings could spread quietly in small groups. Heretical movements had already appeared in the Middle Ages, some organized, some scattered. Authorities were on guard against any gatherings that did not fit into official structures. Guilds were tolerated because they were necessary. They provided labor and regulated the overcrowded urban economy. At the same time, the Church expected guilds to honor God and show outward conformity to doctrine. Masons, whose work was visibly connected to cathedrals and chapels, easily met this expectation. They participated in processions on feast days. They held masses. In the eyes of the bishop, they were pious workers, forewriters of later centuries. This made them the perfect cover for any ideas that did not fit into official teaching. The image of Masons gathering inside unfinished churches, surrounded by columns and empty spaces that only they understood how to complete, was irresistible to those who imagined unorthodox teachings there, perhaps about the nature of Christ or the balance of power between church and crown. Things could be discussed there more freely than from any pulpit. The shadow of the Templars and the transition to mysticism, if the biblical myth of Solomon gives Freemasonry a sacred point of reference, then another story, often used in conspiratorial accounts, serves as a bridge from the Middle Ages to the modern Brotherhood. This is the story of the Knights Templar. The Templars were a military and religious order founded in the 12th century to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land. Over time, they became wealthy bankers and landowners. At the beginning of the 14th century, the French King Philip the Fair moved against them. He ordered their arrest, accused them of heresy, and many were subjected to torture and executed. The order was dissolved by the Pope. This is what is in the official records. What happened to the surviving members is harder to trace. In this space, speculation flourished. According to one popular theory, some Templars fled to Scotland, a kingdom less strictly controlled by the papacy at that time. It is said that there they joined forces with local masonry lodges and passed on their knowledge, symbols, and rituals. Proponents of this theory point to certain carvings and decor in Rosslyn Chapel, a 15th century Scottish church, which seem to echo both Templar emblems and later Masonic motifs. They also note that both groups were in their own way connected to the temple in Jerusalem, and that both had a structure of ranks, oaths, and internal discipline. On this basis, they claim that modern Freemasonry is the institutional descendant of the Band Order, that once possessed enormous political and financial power in Europe, and that it preserved elements of Templar traditions under a new name. Professional historians argue about how substantial the evidence is for a direct link between the Templars and Masons. It is a complex question because both orders valued secrecy, both were destroyed or transformed by events, and both inspired later romantic and political literature that is difficult to separate from fact. However, one thing is clear. The Masons themselves in the 17th and 18th centuries began to adopt the language and degrees of the Templars. In various Masonic rites, rituals of higher levels appeared with names like Knights Templar, Knights of the Temple, and similar titles. This tells us that the Brotherhood saw value in a connection with the lost military order. Whether the blood connection was real or not, it wanted to acquire this aura of persecution, bravery, and proximity to the Holy Land. For observers inclined toward conspiracy theories, this adoption of Templar themes looks like an admission. If the rituals remember the old order, perhaps the lodge records also remember it, in another form. Perhaps a network created for commanding knights and managing treasures learned to survive underground, adopting a more humble appearance. While these layers of legends and associations were accumulating, the daily reality of Masonic lodges in the late Middle Ages and early modern period continued to remain focused on labor. Apprentices came as boys to the construction site. They lived with a master. They learned to hew stones, process them, and lay them in rows. After many years of service, they presented a masterpiece to prove their skill. In the event of acceptance, they became full members of the craft. After that, they were permitted to travel and place their mark on stones as a sign of responsibility. Many cathedrals still bear such marks today. Simple geometric symbols carved on corners and joints. For most of the people who carved them, the lodge was a mixture of a school, a union, a mutual aid society, and a religious brotherhood. It helped bury members, supported widows, and maintained internal justice that kept disputes from spilling out onto the streets. In this itself, there is nothing mysterious. What turns this into something more in retrospect is the decision to attach a special kind of story to this otherwise ordinary structure. A story that geometry is not only a useful tool, but also a sacred language. A story that the craft was always connected with rulers and priests. A story that certain words and signs, once learned, make a person part of something that stretches far beyond his own city and even beyond his own life. In the 17th century, we begin to see evidence that people who were not practicing Masons were being admitted to the lodges. They were called accepted Masons. These were gentlemen, merchants, professionals, often educated people. They came for various reasons. Some were attracted by the moral code and mutual aid. Some were drawn by the mystery and the sense of belonging. Some might have seen in this a way of establishing connections that went beyond class boundaries. This development is of crucial significance because it gradually shifts the center of gravity from the operative craft to speculative symbolism. As soon as a lodge fills with people who never plan on building structures, its rituals and stories acquire more weight than practical rules. Biblical legends, old charters, talk of ancient origins, all of this becomes the common material holding together this diverse company. At this point, the story of Solomon, the story of Euclid, and the story of the Templars becomes something more than just decorations. They turn into the foundation of an identity that is no longer tied to any single craft. By the time a new form of Masonry emerges in London in the early 18th century, with official grand lodges and published constitutions, it can present itself as the heir to all of this. Ancient temple building, the discipline of medieval guilds, persecuted knightly orders, and a secret line of knowledge about numbers, architecture, and morality that supposedly survived fires, wars, and reforms. Whether this line is as continuous as believers claim is a question that different people answer differently. For our narrative, what is important is that this assertion exists, that it is repeated, and that it has consequences. It makes Freemasonry look older than most modern institutions. It makes it harder to control. It creates the impression as if every time rulers thought they had closed the door on some dangerous mixture of wealth, knowledge, and loyalty, that same force found another room to meet in. In the 17th century, long before most people heard the word Mason in its modern understanding, signs had already appeared that the old building lodges were changing. The evidence is not of a dramatic character. It appears in short diary entries and scattered documents. One of the most cited pieces of evidence belongs to an English antiquarian named Elias Ashmole. In 1646, he noted that he was initiated into the Freemasons in a lodge in Warrington. Ashmole was not a practicing Mason. He was a gentleman, a scholar, a collector of manuscripts and curiosities. His presence inside the lodge tells us that the doors were opening to people who did not earn a living with stone and mortar. This is one of several hints that the craft was transforming from a professional association into a broader brotherhood. Lodges began to accept people driven by curiosity, social contacts, or the feeling that these meetings contained something more than a wage agreement or a mutual aid fund. The Grand Lodge and the Age of Enlightenment by the beginning of the 18th century. This shift reached a point where it could be organized on a new level. On a June day in 1717, 4 London lodges met in a tavern known by the name the Goose and Gridiron. Representatives elected a Grand Master and formed what they called the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. The action itself sounds simple. In context, however, it meant that individual lodges would henceforth recognize a central authority, share a set of rules, and coordinate their activity. They took practices that had developed informally for centuries and placed them under the authority of a written constitution. This document, known as the Constitutions of the Freemasons, was published in 1723 under the name of the Presbyterian minister James Anderson. It contained a version of the old charters, a legal framework for governing a lodge, and an expanded legendary history of the craft. Anderson went as far back as the builders of Babylon, ancient Egypt, and Solomon, and then proceeded through European kings, presenting Freemasonry as a continuous thread running through civilization. 4 members of the organization. This narrative framed their gatherings as the latest chapter in a very long story. For critics, it was proof that the organization took itself too seriously, which required attention. The rules established by Anderson also gave the Brotherhood a special character. They required belief in a supreme being but did not approve of political and sectarian disputes. Inside the lodges, the idea was that people of different faiths could meet on neutral territory if they agreed to leave certain disputes outside the door. God was invoked as the great architect of the universe, a title that easily fit a craft rooted in construction. Such an order suited an era when religious wars were still fresh in memory, and when many educated people were turning to what would later be called Enlightenment values. The lodge became a place where a merchant, a lawyer, a minor aristocrat, and a clergyman could sit as brothers and discuss morality, science, and public affairs in a controlled environment. Membership did not erase social ranks, but it created a parallel hierarchy based on degrees and offices that were held for fixed terms and filled through elections. From the very beginning, such a structure encouraged the habit of meeting and making decisions, which had political consequences. A typical lodge kept minutes, elected officers, managed funds, and voted on candidates. Men learned to speak in order, to make and second motions, and to argue without disturbing the peace in the room. These were the same skills that were required in councils, parliaments, and committees. Masonic charity also required organization. Dues were collected. Aid was provided to widows and sick brothers. Money moved according to agreed rules rather than personal inclination. For a person who wanted to practice leadership in a public yet closed context, the lodge offered a training ground. It is no surprise that many of those who later appeared in political life first tested their abilities in these rooms. As the Grand Lodge of London asserted itself, other centres reacted. In Ireland and Scotland, existing lodges had their own traditions and did not always accept instructions from London. Scottish records show the presence of operative lodges much older than many English ones. They cherished their independence and local customs. Over time, separate Grand Lodges were formed in Edinburgh and Dublin. In England itself, disagreements arose over rituals, membership policies, and control. By the middle of the century, two competing bodies existed, one calling itself the Moderns, the other the Ancients. Both claimed to preserve the true practice of Freemasonry. This split created a situation that seemed confusing to outsiders, but in which members of the organization navigated with caution. A person initiated under the authority of one body might or might not be accepted in a lodge of the other. Networks of loyalty were formed, not only around the craft as a whole, but also around its specific versions. Across the English Channel, Freemasonry appeared in France in the 1720s. British and Irish lodges established branches in Paris and other cities. French nobles and officers joined them, attracted by the novelty and the opportunity to socialize with foreigners and representatives of various ranks on terms of ritual equality. In France, the Brotherhood absorbed local tastes. Complex higher degrees developed, often with names referring to chivalry, the temple, and mystical themes. These new layers of rituals went beyond the 3 craft degrees adopted in England. They offered initiates advancement through an ordered series of secrets, where each level added signs, words, and stories. Some systems reached 30 or more degrees. The effect was to create an internal ladder that went upward, even after a person became a full Master Mason. This made the organization more exciting for those who loved ceremonies. It also deepened the sense that internal circles and hidden teachings existed to which only a few would ever gain access. The spread did not stop with France. Lodges appeared in the German states, in the Republic of the United Provinces, Holland, in Italy, Spain, and the Scandinavian kingdoms. In many places, they were introduced by officers returning from service abroad, merchants, and diplomats. Often they began in port cities and capitals, where the population was more mixed and the authorities were accustomed to dealing with foreign influence. The Brotherhood presented itself as a school of virtue, a space for rational discussion, and a proponent of charity. In practice, it gathered people who were already connected to one another or wished to be. In Catholic countries, this combination of private meetings, non-church moral teaching, and contacts with foreigners aroused suspicion. The papacy responded with official condemnation. In 1738, Pope Clement issued a bull forbidding Catholics from joining lodges, citing their oaths, secrecy, and indifferent attitude toward religious differences. Similar decrees were issued by subsequent popes. These rulings did not stop Freemasonry, but they pushed it into a grey zone, where membership could be both prestigious and risky. In Protestant countries, where the church was linked to the state rather than standing above it, the reaction was more ambiguous. Some rulers saw lodges as harmless or even useful places where loyal subjects could meet. Others worried about any group meeting behind closed doors without direct control. In some German principalities, princes took on leadership roles in the craft to keep it under supervision. In others, police spies were present at meetings. The British state, which had a long history of monitoring dissenter clubs and coffeehouse circles, kept an eye on Freemasonry, but rarely took action against it as such. The fact that many officers and colonial administrators were members of lodges made direct suppression less attractive. Instead, concerns were expressed indirectly through pamphlets and satire ridiculing the pretentiousness of men playing at mysteries with rolled-up trousers and passwords. Global network and the New World. The British Empire paved the way for further expansion. Army regiments carried travelling warrants with them, allowing them to open lodges at any location they were stationed. Sailors formed lodges in the ports of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Merchants opened lodges in trading towns, where European communities took root. In North America, lodges appeared in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston. Some received charters directly from London, others received warrants from Irish or Scottish authorities. These colonial lodges united people who would later play an important role in local politics and the eventual break with Britain. At this stage, however, they function primarily as clubs for mutual aid, social contact, and discussion. Inside the lodge room, certain practices reinforced a sense of belonging to a separate and structured body. Candidates were proposed and vetted. Secret voting using white and black balls determined acceptance. A single no vote from a lodge member could block a person's path. After initiation, a brother could travel and ask for admission to other lodges by providing the correct signs and words. Officers sat in fixed positions, facing each other across the room. Rituals followed a set pattern with questions and answers that every member had to learn. The physical layout and forms of speech created a recognizable environment that could be reproduced in any city or port, provided enough members were present. This standardization allowed a person to move from Scotland to London or Boston and still feel that they knew the rules of the room they entered. Membership lists from this period demonstrate a wide range of professions and ranks. In urban lodges, one could meet artisans, shopkeepers, printers, lawyers, government officials, and occasionally titled persons. The presence of printers and publishers is notable because it meant a direct link between Freemasonry and the emerging public sphere of newspapers and pamphlets. Ideas discussed in the lodge might later appear in essays on government, morality, or civic life, stripped of identifying marks. The Brotherhood did not need an official policy to influence debates. It only needed members who wrote and spoke in other venues. At the same time, clear boundaries existed. Most lodges accepted only men. In many places, there were informal or formal barriers to the admission of Jews, people of color, or persons without property. Some of these restrictions reflected broad social prejudices. Others were part of an effort to keep the Brotherhood within the respectable layers of society. Despite all the talk of equality between brothers, many lodges functioned as elite clubs filtering those who entered. This selectivity made them attractive as spaces where business partnerships could form and political alliances could be tested in relative privacy. Before being presented to the general public, the combination of reach, ritual, and discretion became the reason for the first accusations of secret influence at the end of the 18th century. As revolutions shook established orders, conservative writers in Europe began to claim that Masonic lodges were not just reflecting the new ideas of the era, but were actively planning and spreading them. They pointed out that the Brotherhood crossed national boundaries and included people engaged in politics, the military, and the economy. They noted that members of the order called each other brothers and were obliged to provide mutual assistance to one another. They observed that outrage at events in one country seemed to find an echo in another, where lodges were strong. From these observations, they drew conclusions about coordination and intent. It is important to note that the lodges themselves cultivated a sense of special knowledge, which encouraged such interpretations. Teachings were presented as light bestowed upon the candidate. Symbols were presented as keys to moral and philosophical lessons. Higher degrees claimed to reveal deeper levels of meaning. The atmosphere inside the lodge was designed to make a person feel they had entered a different order of understanding. In an era fascinated by natural philosophy, secret experiments, and cipher societies, this was part of the appeal. But it also generated an obvious question in the minds of many. If people are capable of keeping such secrets about symbols and stories, what else might they be hiding? If they swore to support each other, How far did that support go when members of the order found themselves in councils, courts, and ministries? By the final decades of the century, Freemasonry had become a familiar phenomenon in cities from London to Philadelphia, from Paris to Vienna. It had also become a screen onto which people projected their hopes and fears about the emerging new type of social life. For some, the large rooms represented a model for civil society. For others, they looked like rehearsal halls for hidden influence. The same network that could organize charity and promote education could also, in the eyes of critics, organize dissent and advance agendas that were never presented to the broad masses. Freemasonry and the American Revolution. By the middle of the 18th century, Freemasonry had transformed from an English project with foreign branches into a network capable of surviving changes in government and existing beyond borders. This was significant as the Atlantic world entered a period where all political habits were collapsing and new ones were being invented in real time. People often described the American and French revolutions as explosions of ideas, but the daily reality was organization. People had to meet, argue, vote, coordinate actions, raise funds, keep secrets, recruit allies, and maintain discipline when the consequence of a careless phrase could be prison or death. In such an environment, the appeal of the lodge was practical. It offered a ready-made structure, a process for vetting trusted individuals, a vocabulary of brotherhood, and a habit of private meetings that did not look unusual in cities already full of clubs, guilds, and societies. It is at this point that Freemasonry becomes difficult to separate from broader political culture, because the same people who attended the lodge also worked in committees, printed newspapers, managed businesses, and held government offices. Even when the lodge did not issue political orders, it created relationships, and relationships are often what define the movement of power. In the American colonies, lodges existed even before independence and grew along with ports and cities. They were part of the vast associative life of British North America alongside churches, militias, merchant societies, and reading groups. Many of those who became prominent figures in revolutionary politics also joined lodges at some point in their careers. Benjamin Franklin, who moved between Philadelphia, London, and Paris for years, is a prime example of how these circles intersected. He was a printer and publisher, a community organizer, a diplomat, and a man who understood the value of networks. Freemasonry fit comfortably into this world because it crossed boundaries that formal institutions often could not overcome. A lodge might include merchants who controlled shipping, lawyers who knew the courts, artisans who had influence on the streets, and military officers capable of enforcing decisions. In the years preceding open conflict with Britain, these connections mattered for practical tasks such as fundraising, disseminating information, and coordinating between cities. The case of George Washington is often cited because he became the public symbol of the new nation, and because his Masonic affiliation was widely known. He joined a lodge as a young man in Virginia, and remained connected to Masonic circles for most of his life. In public ceremonies during and after the Revolution, Masonic participation was visible, especially in events such as the laying of cornerstones, where the language of building and civil order matched the image of the new republic as a constructed project. When the war began, the question was not whether the Masons controlled the revolution, but how the Brotherhood formed the environment in which the revolution was organized. The Continental Army was a mobile institution consisting of people from different colonies and with different backgrounds, and it relied on trust over distances. Military lodges existed in the British Army, and similar practices appeared on the American side. Officers who were members of the order could recognize each other through shared rituals and create quick connections in conditions where formal rank was not always enough to establish loyalty. This is one of the reasons why Freemasonry remains a central theme in later accounts of the so-called Masonic Republic. The logic is as follows. If you have a network that is already international and structured by us. And if you place members of this network in leadership roles during the founding of a new state, then the new state may bear the imprint of that network, even if no one officially announces it. If the American story is partially dedicated to how lodges fit into the existing culture of civic associations, then the French story is more volatile because the revolution in France did not end with independence and a stable constitution. It went through phases that turned allies into enemies and made survival dependent on political orientation. By the end of the 18th century, Freemasonry was firmly established in France, especially among elites and professionals. The Grand Orient of France became the central governing body, and its lodges attracted nobles, officers, writers, and administrators. Philippe d'Orléans, who later took the name Philippe Gallet, is the figure most often used to show how deeply Freemasonry could be linked to high politics. He was the king's cousin, wealthy, ambitious, and involved in political reform circles. He also held the post of Grand Master of French Freemasonry in the years before the Revolution. His life shows the limits of any idea that Freemasonry guaranteed protection. He voted for the execution of King Louis V, and was later executed himself, a reminder that membership in the Brotherhood did not take priority over the logic of revolutionary power. The French Revolution gave birth to a specific kind of claim about Freemasonry that would resonate for centuries. It was claimed not only that Masons were present in the revolutionary movement, but that the lodges prepared the revolution, organized it, and used it to destroy the church and the monarchy. This argument gained strength not because it was proven in a legal sense, but because it met the needs of people trying to explain the catastrophe after the Terror. Many French conservatives and clergy wanted to find a single cause that could explain the collapse of the old power. A secret society was an attractive answer, as it shifted responsibility from broad social conditions to a specific enemy. Authors such as Abbe Augustin Barreau argued that revolutionary violence was not a spontaneous result of hunger, war, and political collapse, but the outcome of planning by hidden groups. In these reports, Masons rarely appeared alone. They were often grouped with the Illuminati, radicals, and other imagined networks. The general picture presented an underground coalition using lodges as meeting places and ritual secrecy as a cover, regardless of whether the lodges actually acted as revolutionary command centers. This claim itself became one of the most influential conspiracy narratives in modern European history. A key reason these claims survived is that the revolution did create scenes that looked like betrayal within the Brotherhood. People who shared lodge membership could find themselves on opposite sides of political processes. Some supported a constitutional monarchy, others a republic, and still others radical measures. In a period when political clubs like the Jacobins became centers of power, relationships in the lodges could intersect with relationships in the clubs, and personal loyalty was tested under extreme pressure. When it was later said that brothers sent brothers to the guillotine, it expressed the real dynamics of revolutionary France. Even if the exact links through the lodges were often less obvious than legend suggests, the lodge may have been only one of many networks, but it was one of the few that openly valued secrecy. And secrecy makes any political rupture look like a clandestine conspiracy. Transatlantic ties and the ideology of revolution. The transatlantic connection added another layer. France supported the American rebels against Britain, and French officers returned home with the experience of a successful revolution. At the same time, American diplomats and visitors circulated in French elite circles. Franklin's stay in Paris is often used as evidence of how these networks intersected. He was not only a diplomat negotiating alliances, but also a social figure who understood the ways of salons, clubs, and the value of brotherhood. In later retellings, this turns into a story of a shared Masonic ideology, moving back and forth across the ocean, and shaping revolutions as if they were coordinated chapters of a single plan. Evidence of direct coordination at such a level is hard to pin down, but for a conspiracy idea to work, it is not necessary. All that is required is the reality that similar groups existed in both places, that the same names appeared in large records and political events, and that the revolutionary language of liberty and fraternity sounded the same as the language used inside the lodges. It is also important to notice what distinguished Freemasonry from other clubs of that era. Many political clubs were open in the sense that outsiders could attend their public meetings, or at least observe them. Newspapers covered their debates. Their leaders made statements. Freemasonry did not work that way. It did not publish its rituals. It taught through degrees and insisted that parts of its practice remain private. It also built internal discipline and obedience to lodge rules, and respect for the hierarchy within the room. Such a combination could look like a parallel power structure. To a person fearing revolution, it was easy to imagine that the lodge was training people to obey the orders not of the crown or the church, but of an internal chain of command. To a person supporting reform, it was easy to imagine that the lodge was training people to live by a higher moral code than the corrupt politics around them. Both interpretations could latch onto the same set of facts. The idea of a Masonic republic is best understood as an inference made based on patterns, rather than a document signed in secret. Patterns of membership among influential people. Patterns of lodge growth in cities that became centers of revolutionary organization. Patterns of symbols and language that seemed to echo from lodge rooms into civic ceremonies. Patterns of mutual aid that could look like an exchange of favors when applied in politics. In the United States, the early republic had a culture of ceremonies, processions, and public rites. Masonic lodges felt comfortable in this world because they already used ritual and symbolic actions. When Masons appeared in public in aprons and with tools as emblems, it could be read as civic theater or as a sign of a private order openly displaying itself. When they participated in the laying of cornerstones and funerals, it could be perceived as harmless tradition or as a public claim to ownership of the nation's founding history. In the 1820s, the United States was still young enough for reputations and institutions to change quickly, but already old enough for people to begin arguing about what kind of country they would become. The language of revolution was still familiar, and suspicion of concentrated power was still considered a civic virtue. At the same time, American public life was becoming more organized. Newspapers reached a wider audience. Campaigns were becoming more professional. Fraternal organizations were common, and among them, Freemasonry stood out for its secrecy and the fact that it attracted influential people. Lodges were present in towns and cities, and Masons were in courts, legislatures, banks, and militia structures. For many Americans, this was not automatically alarming, but the conditions were already in place for a single scandal to turn Freemasonry from a private brotherhood into a national problem. This scandal centered on a man named William Morgan. Morgan was not a well-known figure in American history before he became one. He was a laborer in western New York State who moved within the turbulent economy of the early republic. He was connected to Freemasonry and, as these stories often begin, became estranged. Whether his motives were revenge, money, a personal grudge, or the belief that the public had a right to know, he threatened to publish what he called the secrets of the order. This idea struck at the very heart of what bound the Brotherhood together. In the world of lodges, ritual was not decoration. It was a mechanism separating insiders from outsiders and creating trust at a distance. If the words and signs could be printed and sold, then anyone could mimic membership. The events that followed were confusing in detail and clear in their effect. Morgan was arrested on charges that looked minor and suspicious. He was held, released, and then seized again. He disappeared. A simple question arose: where did he go? And a deeper question: who possessed the power to make a man disappear? Reports at the time claimed that local Masons, angered by the threat of exposure, used their connections to exert pressure through legal mechanisms. It was claimed that policemen, sheriffs, jailers, and justices of the peace played their parts or, at the very least, looked the other way at critical moments. Whether the public believed in Morgan's murder, kidnapping, or secret removal. The result was the same. People came to believe that institutions designed to protect citizens had been bent to protect the Brotherhood. This belief mattered more than any individual piece of evidence, because it struck a nerve in American politics. The legitimacy of the Republic depended on the idea that the law applies to everyone equally, and that no private allegiance stands above citizenship. The Morgan case seemed to represent a situation where a private oath had indeed taken precedence over public duty. Critics argued that a Mason in a leadership position would always face a conflict of interest. If a judge, juror, sheriff, or legislator is bound by ties of brotherly loyalty to other Masons, the public can never be certain where his true devotion lies. This suspicion became a political weapon. The reaction in Western New York escalated into a broad anti-Masonic movement with unusual speed. Public meetings were held. Committees gathered testimony. Newspapers printed accusations and counter-accusations. For many citizens, the secrecy of Freemasonry made a standard investigation difficult. Lodges did not open their records. Members denied or minimized their knowledge. Witnesses spoke reluctantly. This reluctance was interpreted not as individual caution, but as proof of a coordinated cover-up. The missing man became a symbol of what secrecy can do to an open society. This was also the moment when American politics was transitioning from elite consensus to mass participation. The Morgan affair transformed anti-Masonry into a political identity that could be mobilized. It gave birth to the first sustained third-party movement in U.S. history, the Anti-Masonic Party. This party formed around the idea that a secret society had corrupted state institutions. People were ready to build a political machine around the issue of brotherly secrecy. They held conventions, nominated candidates, issued platforms, and ran campaigns focused on one central assertion: no secret order should hold private power in the Republic. The Anti-Masonic Party also introduced practices that shaped American politics more broadly. It used a national convention to select a presidential candidate. It built a network of newspapers. It organized at the local and state levels. The anti-Masonic argument was structural. It was believed that the very existence of Freemasonry as a secret organization, bound by oaths, was incompatible with Republican government. Once this assertion was accepted, any Mason in public office could be presented as a threat. Defenders of Freemasonry responded in different ways, and each response carried a risk. Some argued that the Brotherhood was harmless and the ritual symbolic. Others claimed that Morgan was not a victim, but had staged his own disappearance. A third response was silence. Lodges closed ranks in the hope that the storm would pass. But silence in a scandal about secrecy is a kind of fuel. It confirms the critic's logic. The order does not answer because it cannot answer without exposing itself. The conspiracy template and the social power of suspicion. It was here that conspiracy thinking transformed from a simple attitude toward the world into a full-fledged framework. The Morgan case created a narrative template that was used again and again in subsequent decades. A secret society exists. A defector threatens exposure. An inexplicable fate befalls the defector. Authorities act strangely. The society denies involvement. The public concludes that secrecy itself is the mechanism of control. Once people have this template, they can apply it to any other events. They begin to interpret accidents, career rises, court outcomes, and political decisions through the prism of invisible coordination. A lodge does not need to prove its power. Its secrecy makes proving the opposite practically impossible. In the years after Morgan's disappearance, anti-Masonic sentiment became a powerful social force. It was not limited to politics. Churches preached against Freemasonry. Employers and communities questioned lodge membership. Families argued about whether a man should remain in his lodge. Public ceremonies involving Masons became objects of protest. In some places, Masons resigned or stopped attending meetings. In others, they defended their membership as part of their identity. The country's newspapers turned lodge life into public entertainment, printing descriptions of rituals, exposing symbols and ridiculing the Brotherhood. The act of exposure became a kind of counter-ritual way for outsiders to assert their power over a system built on controlled information. At the same time, the intensity of the movement generated its own distortions. Once Freemasonry was considered the hidden cause of injustice, the temptation arose to see it everywhere. If a judge made a ruling someone disliked, it was easy to suspect him of lodge ties. If a banker prospered, people suspected brotherly support. If a politician received votes, a network of lodges might be behind it. The Brotherhood became a universal explanation for outcomes that were actually complex. This is one reason why the story of the Morgan case remains important. It was not just a local crime with national consequences. It was the moment when the American public learned to perceive Freemasonry as a system that could plausibly operate behind the facade of visible democratic institutions. There was also a practical reason why the Morgan case affected people so deeply. Many Americans knew Masons personally. The lodge was not a distant secret. It was the shop owner, the sheriff, the doctor, the lawyer, the priest, the neighbor. This proximity made the suspicion more intimate. If a lodge could protect its own, then a person who was not a member might worry about being at a disadvantage in business, court, or civic life. Anti-Masonic rhetoric often returned to this point. It claimed that Freemasonry created two classes of citizens: the brothers and everyone else. This claim was difficult to refute because it was based not on a single event, but on a plausible mechanism. People help their friends and allies. A ritual oath formalizes this help and extends it beyond personal acquaintance. The rise and subsequent decline of the anti-Masonic party also show how such controversies evolve. In some elections, anti-Masonic candidates gained real power. The movement influenced the agenda of the major parties, forcing them to pay attention to public concern about secret influence and corruption. Over time, however, other issues came to the forefront, including economic conflicts and debates over slavery. But even as the party faded, the suspicion did not disappear. It became part of American political culture, ready to be revived when new scandals again made secrecy look dangerous. For Freemasonry itself, the crisis forced adaptation. Lodges became more cautious about their public image. In some regions, they increased charitable activities and made them more visible, presenting the Brotherhood as a public good rather than a private club. They emphasized moral teaching and community service. Nevertheless, the basic structure remained the same. Degrees, signs, words, and private ceremonies continued. The Brotherhood remained selective and continued to reward loyalty among members. This meant that the underlying suspicion could never fully vanish. A group can open its charitable books to the public, but it cannot open its inner identity without becoming something else. By the time the United States entered the period of national consolidation, Freemasonry had become so familiar that it could function quietly in the background of public life. This is when symbols begin to mean more than most people think. A young nation needs symbols because it needs legitimacy, unity, and a history it can put on display. The Great Seal of the United States is the most enduring example. Congress adopted the seal in 1782. On its reverse side is an unfinished pyramid with 13 steps, and above it is an eye in a triangle, surrounded by rays. In the official description, this is called an unfinished pyramid and an eye in a triangle at the zenith, with mottos signifying providence and a new era. The eye itself was not invented by Masons, it was a familiar symbol in the religious art of the time, signifying divine oversight. What turns the Great Seal into a central artifact of secret history is that it sits at the intersection of civic authority and esoteric imagery. An eye in a triangle is simple enough to be read as God, but also specific enough to be perceived as an emblem of hidden knowledge. A pyramid is simple enough to signify strength and duration, but also ancient enough to evoke reflections on Egypt and initiation traditions. In a conspiracy interpretation, the seal becomes a declaration that a new order is being built, not only political, but spiritual, and that the builders want the public to accept it without fully understanding it. The next object of attention is Washington, D.C. The capital was planned deliberately rather than growing gradually. Pierre L'Enfant's plan overlays a grid with broad diagonal avenues, circles, and important vistas that link symbolic centers of power. It is a city built to be read, to direct movement and attention. This is precisely why it triggers claims about hidden geometry. The fact that the city was commissioned by a Mason president, Washington, and built in an environment where Masons were active provides fodder for suspicion. In this view, L'Enfant did not even need to be a Mason for his plan to align with Masonic ideas about order, measurement, and symbolism. The city becomes a stage where these ideas are expressed through architecture. People trace triangles and pentagrams on maps, connecting the White House, the Capitol, and the major monuments. The Capitol and the ritual of foundation, they view the diagonal avenues as deliberate lines, like the lines of a compass drawn across the earth. They argue that the placement of key buildings reflects a symbolic program mirroring Masonic themes of East and West, light and darkness, ascension, initiation, and the movement from the rough ashlar to the perfect one. Some of these claims focus on geometry itself. Others focus on ceremonies, for it is in them that symbolism becomes visible in official records. This is one of the reasons why the 1793 cornerstone laying ceremony of the Capitol is so often cited. On September 18, 1793, George Washington laid the first stone of the U.S. Capitol in a Masonic ceremony. Descriptions tell of a procession, Masons in regalia, and Washington's participation in the rite itself. Historical reports from the Senate note that Washington crossed the Potomac, where he was met by bands, a volunteer artillery company, and a delegation of Masons in full dress, after which he took part in a grand procession from the construction sites to the location of the Capitol's erection. If you are looking for a moment where the Brotherhood literally touches the architecture of the nation's foundation, this is it. It is not a rumor. It is a documented public event. That is why it carries such weight in secret history. It suggests that state building was not only a bureaucratic and legal process, but also a ritual one. A cornerstone is not just a stone. It is a statement about the foundation. When a president participates in a ritual using symbols of corn, wine, and oil in the eyes of the public, that act can be read as civic piety or as the initiation of the republic itself. The appeal of this material lies in the fact that it is simultaneously mundane and highly significant. In the 18th century, stone-laying ceremonies with ritual elements were not rare. They were part of a broad culture, civic religion. At the same time, Freemasonry had its specific forms and tools, and Washington's participation gave these forms national visibility. A person inclined to see Freemasonry as a moral brotherhood will perceive this as a gesture of unity. However, someone who sees it as a network of influence will consider it a public marker of the Brotherhood's presence at the creation of the nation's most important building. Laws can be changed. A building stands. Once you accept that symbols can be used as signals, you begin to see how the Great Seal and the city plan reinforce each other in the imagination. The seal places an eye over a pyramid. The city plan places power within the geometry of avenues and circles. Over time, this transforms into an entire ecosystem of meanings. People who believe in a hidden order do not need a single smoking gun. They build proof by accumulating facts, membership lists among the founders, lodges in ports, rituals in civic rites, and iconography reminiscent of initiation symbols. They argue that the lodge works as a system of internal passports, allowing members to recognize each other and cooperate across distances and party lines. Then they look at early American state building, which required precisely such cooperation, and conclude that the lodge provided an advantage with which outsiders could not compete. This line of thinking changes how people look at American money. The $1 bill becomes a kind of portable conspiracy document. If the symbol is meaningless, why put it where everyone will hold it in their hands? Official history answers this with the language of 18th century classical education. Secret history with an interpretation of the symbol as deliberate concealment. Power lies not in hiding the image, but in hiding its meaning in plain sight. Washington continues to replenish this interpretation with new layers. As the city grew in the 19th and 20th centuries, every new addition could be interpreted as part of an ongoing plan. When the Washington Monument is erected in the form of an obelisk, it triggers comparisons with Egypt, sun worship, and ancient geometry, regardless of whether the engineers planned it that way. When new memorials are aligned with existing axes, it suggests a sacred layout. A network of lodges capable of linking influential people could also draw boundaries of belonging. In practice, many lodges reflected the racial and religious divisions of their societies. As the 19th century progressed, and the nation struggled over slavery and built new forms of industrial power, the question of control over institutions became sharper. A secret brotherhood that promised mutual aid could be perceived as both a system of civic support and a mechanism of private control. This tension intensified in the post-Civil War era, when organizations modeled after brotherhoods began to play openly political and sometimes violent roles. After the Morgan Affair, Freemasonry did not disappear, but adapted. In 19th century America, where formal institutions were often weak and personal reputation meant everything, fraternal networks became more valuable. The lodge offered a structured way of establishing trust in conditions of constant relocation. In an era before the emergence of modern professional licensing, membership in a brotherhood was a real form of security. The Civil War did not just split the nation, it remade social hierarchies. Millions of veterans returned to civilian life with habits of discipline, ritual, and group identity. In the South, defeat and Reconstruction created an environment in which secret and semi-secret organizations multiplied. The tools were predictable: oaths, signs, passwords, and nightly meetings. Freemasonry did not issue orders, but its methods were in the air, and the culture of brotherhood gave them legitimacy. One of the central figures drawing Freemasonry into the history of the post-war South is Albert Pike, a lawyer, poet, Confederate Army officer, and later the most influential administrator of the Scottish Rite in the U.S. The Scottish Rite is a system of higher degrees expanding the ritual world of Freemasonry. In the decades after the war, Pike's authority made him the guardian of meaning for a vast portion of American Freemasonry. He rewrote the rituals and standardized the degrees, presenting the rite as a profound philosophical project. For supporters, he was a builder of tradition. For critics, he looked like a man using ritual to bind the brotherhood to a worldview shaped by the defeat of the Confederacy and subsequent social conflicts. Pike's influence reflects a broader fact of the time. Fraternal organizations were a way for men to cope with loss and political change. In the North, veterans joined the Grand Army of the Republic. In the South, they formed networks that preserved the memory of the Confederacy. Some of these networks were public, others were hidden. Some organizations were not so harmless. Freemasonry is significant not because it necessarily caused these events, but because it provided a respected template for structured male associations. When a group wants to appear serious, it borrows a serious form. Freemasonry, with its degrees, regalia, and ceremonial language, provided a form already familiar to many elites. It also allowed for the connection of local power structures across different cities and states. A lodge could include judges, sheriffs, bankers, and priests. There is nothing unusual about this, but in a period when the South was fighting for control over courts, police, and elections, the presence of fraternal loyalty within these institutions became politically charged. If the people enforcing the law also belonged to a private circle bound by oaths, outsiders reasonably wondered, where are the decisions truly being made? This is the setting in which the Ku Klux Klan enters history. The first Klan was formed in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee, by former Confederate soldiers. It began as a sort of social club, but quickly transformed into an instrument of terror, aimed at establishing white supremacy and undermining Reconstruction governments. The Klan did not invent secrecy or violence, but it combined them with performance and structure in a way that made it highly adaptive. It used costumes and titles. It used coded language. It created local cells and superior leadership roles. It claimed to protect the moral order. It also used intimidation, assault, and murder. The central question of this part of history is why the clan's organizational style looks familiar to anyone studying the culture of brotherhoods. This happens not only because many 19th century men belonged to lodges, it is because the clan consciously adopted features that make a brotherhood cohesive. It created a sense of belonging that could survive fear and secrecy. It offered initiation and hierarchy. It built identity through ritual. These are the same tools that make any hidden network workable, but in the American context, they resembled the outward forms of groups like Freemasonry. This similarity led to the long-standing claim that the clan modeled itself after Freemasonry or, at the very least, borrowed much from it. There are several levels to this claim. The first is a simple overlap of membership. In the 19th century, Freemasonry was widespread among white professionals, including officers. Therefore, it is not surprising that some early clansmen were Masons. The second layer is structural similarity. The clan used grandiose titles and a system of ranks echoing the vocabulary of fraternal orders. The third is ritual similarity. The clan used initiations, secrecy, oaths, and signs. This does not prove direct copying, but confirms that fraternal forms were a known model for creating a disciplined organization. The fourth layer is symbolic. Both Freemasonry and the clan drew upon imaginary medieval chivalry, moral duty, and the idea of an elite brotherhood protecting order. In the Scottish Rite and other systems of higher degrees, there are rituals with knightly themes. The clan presented itself in a distorted version of the same style, casting violence as the protection of community and virtue. This is not an endorsement in any form. It is a description of how movements legitimize themselves. They clothe themselves in familiar moral language because naked power is harder to sell. The name most often used to connect these worlds is Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest was a Confederate cavalry commander, later associated with the early leadership of the clan. In many accounts, he is called the first Grand Wizard. Forrest's biography makes him a useful symbol, as he embodies the post-war transition from battlefield command to shadow politics. He also had ties in brotherhoods, including Freemasonry. This fact is often cited to suggest that the clan's structure was not an improvisation, but was borrowed from existing organizational habits. Whether Forrest personally was the one who imported Masonic practice into the clan or not, the fact remains. Many Southern elites were familiar with large systems and could reproduce their structure. When creating new groups, Albert Pike is brought back into this picture again, often in a speculative key. Pike was a Confederate general and a leading figure of the Scottish Rite, and critics have argued that he was the direct architect of the clan's rituals or ideology. Evidence of Pike's direct membership in the clan has been contested for a long time, and the historical records are not clear enough to state this as a fact without reservation. What can be said with more certainty is that Pike's writings and leadership helped define a ritual world that appealed to people who loved hierarchy, symbolism, and elite identity. In the environment of the post-war South, ideas and forms could move from one context to another without a formal order. A man who attended a lodge and then joined a vigilante organization already knew how to conduct meetings, how to ensure silence, how to create levels of access, and how to use ceremonies to strengthen loyalty. It is important to understand that in the U.S., after the Civil War, there was a boom in fraternal orders in general. The Odd Fellows, Knights of Pythias, and many others. They offered insurance, burial support, and social status. This normalized the idea that private ritual and public respectability could coexist. It made the sight of regalia and secret handshakes familiar. In such an environment, the difference between a harmless brotherhood and a political network could blow in the public imagination. When people suspected the clan of hidden coordination, they often turned to the most prominent model of hidden coordination they knew: Freemasonry. The racial dimension cannot be viewed as a secondary issue. Many mainstream lodges in the U.S. in practice excluded black men. Even if the official language of Freemasonry spoke of universal brotherhood, at the same time, black Freemasonry existed through organizations such as Prince Hall Freemasonry, which arose at the end of the 18th century. The existence of black lodges demonstrates that the tools of brotherhood could be used differently, depending on the society. For black Americans, the lodge could be a tool for mutual aid and civic organization in a hostile environment. For white supremacist groups, the secret brotherhood model could be used to coordinate intimidation. The intersection here is not moral, but structural. The same organizational technology can be used for diametrically opposite purposes. Here, the tone of the conspiracy idea changes. If early suspicions regarding Freemasonry concerned democratic transparency, in the post-war South, suspicion becomes specific. People were attacked and killed by organized groups acting under masks. They were driven away from polling stations. In such a context, the fear of hidden networks was not theoretical. When citizens believed that local officials sympathized with the Klan or were its members, the logic resembled the Morgan case, but the stakes were higher. The question arose again: can private loyalty outweigh public duty? For Freemasonry itself, this period created a long-term reputational problem. Even if the lodges did not approve of the Klan, the shared culture of secrecy made it difficult for outsiders to separate one private network from another. When people hear that influential men belong to a secret society, and simultaneously hear that a terrorist organization is built on oaths and secrecy, they assume a connection. The Scottish Rite and Albert Pike remain central figures in this part of the story, illustrating how ritual can be used to create a strong identity that seems larger than just politics. The post-war decades were the years when American public memory began to form. The lost cause narrative of the Confederacy developed through monuments, speeches, and textbooks. The culture of brotherhoods easily fit into this project, as it valued ceremonies, processions, dedications, memorial services. All these were familiar forms. Lodges and veteran groups used them to strengthen identity. This did not mean they were secretly plotting a seizure of power, but it did mean they were participating in the struggle over what the nation would say about itself. By the end of the 19th century, the U.S. had become a country where belonging to a brotherhood could still open doors, but where the public was learning to perceive such belonging as a sign of a hidden alliance. Freemasonry remained socially respectable among business elites, but the growth of other secret groups made secrecy itself a warning sign. This tension was not resolved. It turned into a stable feature of the American imagination. A man could belong to a private brotherhood, gain trust and access, and then act in public life using this loyalty as an advantage. The public might suspect that a respectable brotherhood and a violent brotherhood were different faces of the same deep system. Such a conclusion flourishes in societies where transparency is valued but not always ensured. Dictatorships versus the lodges. The hunt for loyalty in the early 20th century. The fear of Freemasonry migrated from pamphlets and election speeches into state policy. This happened for a practical reason. Modern dictatorships were built on total control over information, loyalty, and organizations capable of mobilizing people outside the state apparatus. Freemasonry possessed all the qualities that such regimes hated. It held private meetings, observed internal rules, created ties that crossed class and national boundaries, and used a system of signs for mutual recognition. Authoritarian governments did not need proof of a conspiracy. The belief that a network could become an alternative source of devotion was enough for them. This model clearly manifested in fascist Italy even before the Nazis came to power in Germany. Mussolini consolidated power by absorbing or destroying independent institutions. In the mid-1920s, his government launched a direct offensive. A 1925 law effectively banned the Brotherhood, and soon fascist authorities seized the headquarters of the Grand Orient in the Palazzo Giustiniani in Rome. This was not a symbolic warning, it was an administrative seizure supported by the police. Lodges were closed, archives were confiscated, and membership became a stigma in a regime where loyalty had to belong to only one master, the state. In Germany, the Nazis used a more complex ideological framework. They presented Freemasonry not just as an independent association, but as part of a global conspiracy. Nazi propaganda persistently linked Jews and Masons, promoting the idea of a Judeo-Masonic conspiracy against Germany. This turned internal repression into a matter of national defense. Once the public is convinced that a secret society works hand in hand with an ethnic group, declared an existential threat, any brutal measure is justified as protecting the state. Administrative steps followed immediately. By 1935, the Nazi state had completely banned Freemasonry. The point was not just to stop meetings, but to seize the mechanics of the network. Large buildings housed lists of names, addresses, correspondence, and data on charitable funds. The Nazis practiced management through files. They did not need to guess who was a Mason, they simply read the lists. The lists became weapons. Civil servants and teachers with Masonic ties were fired. Officers were interrogated, and people were forced to sign renunciations of the Brotherhood, under the threat of losing their jobs and social status. With the intensification of repression, persecution moved from officers to prisons. Masons were among those sent to concentration camps. They were usually classified as political prisoners. In the camp marking system, they wore the same signs as other political opponents of the regime, sometimes with additional identifiers. For the Nazis, membership in the Brotherhood was a punishable identity. Why was the Nazi campaign against Freemasonry so fierce? The dictatorship feared and controlled connections. Nazi rule required the replacement of old attachments, church, unions, clubs with loyalty to the party and the FRA. Freemasonry, with its international ties and moral language not dictated by the party, represented a category that could not be controlled from within. Even if a lodge never discussed politics, it generated trust between people who held important posts. For a dictator, this was enough. Proof of a conspiracy is not needed. The mere possibility that a group of cohesive people might refuse to carry out an order or coordinate resistance is sufficient. Persecutions were not limited to Germany. As Nazi influence spread, the same hostility manifested in various forms across Europe. In Spain under Franco, the anti-Masonic impulse became law. In 1940, Franco issued the law for the suppression of Freemasonry and communism. Freemasonry was intentionally placed in the same category as communism, although socially they were completely different. This allowed the regime to attack any political opponents under the banner of national cleansing. In the authoritarian imagination, Freemasonry is always an underground government. In Italy, the fascist ban led to long-term consequences. The crushing of the lodges did not erase social ties but drove them deep underground. When an organization is deprived of legal status, ordinary members leave, and the most risk-prone and closed groups remain at the center. They become more dependent on political factions for survival. This is one of the structural reasons why later scandals in Italy, such as the P2 Large case, bore the Masonic label. A ban does not destroy a network, it changes its behavior, making it truly dangerous and opaque. The US watched this from afar, but not dispassionately. For some Americans, the Nazi attacks were proof that Masons were part of the liberal society that dictators were trying to destroy. For others, conspiracy theorists, it was proof that the dictators knew the truth about the secret influence of the lodges. The operational aspect is often overlooked. By seizing archives, the intelligence services of dictatorships gain not just names, but a map of relationships. Who corresponded with whom, who vouched for whom, who possessed money and connections abroad. In an authoritarian system, this is invaluable intelligence. It helped identify leaders and potential pockets of resistance, and also served as a tool for blackmail. In a regime where Freemasonry was equated with treason, the threat of exposure became a lever of pressure that could be used for years without any trial. By the end of the Second World War, the physical destruction was obvious. Lodges plundered, archives scattered, members of the order killed or exiled. But a less noticeable effect was on the reputation of Freemasonry. Now Freemasonry had a dual identity in the public eye. It was both the manipulator of politics and the victim of totalitarian regimes. After the war, Freemasonry in Europe was restored. But the world had changed. Intelligence services and the Cold War normalized secrecy within government administration itself. In a world where political conflicts moved into shadow channels, a brotherhood built on discretion could be perceived as a harmless tradition, or as another layer in a landscape full of hidden structures, where democracy is weak and corruption is high. The belief that an inner circle operates behind the backs of official institutions becomes an axiom. The word Masonic became a universal designation for any kind of hidden coordination, whether the official brotherhood acknowledges it or not.